today's video, we uncover the Everest fraud whose career was built on lies, and how the mountain made him pay for everything. Years of fabricated summits fed an arrogance that convinced him the death zone could be fooled, and Everest exposed him in the most brutal way possible. The horrifying truth that emerged afterwards made the climbing world question everything they believed in. It was April 12th, 2017, and Everest Base Camp sat at 17,600 feet on the broken surface of the Khumbu Glacier, a tense city of more than 300 climbers spread across moraine and ice beneath the looming chaos of the Khumbu icefall. Spring light warmed the glacier by midday, sending meltwater trickling through gravel channels between expedition clusters. Prayer flags snapped in wind that carried the smell of ice and the faint hum of generators from the larger mess tents. Above camp, the icefall rose in a cascade of seracs and crevasses, the route already fixed with ropes and aluminum ladders. Beyond that, the western SAWM, the Lhotse face, and the summit pyramid that caught the last light each evening in a way that made it look deceptively close. The season was building toward the narrow weather windows that May would deliver, and every expedition at base camp was running the same calculation. Weeks of preparation, compressed into a handful of days where the mountain might allow passage to the top. Among those preparing was Niels Dekker, a 29-year-old from Utrecht, Netherlands, who arrived at base camp with the easy confidence of someone who believed he had already proven himself on the world's highest peaks. He was fit, charismatic, and photogenic, the kind of person who made mountaineering look aspirational rather than desperate. His social media following of roughly 55,000 had been built on a carefully constructed narrative of adventure and achievement, with professional quality summit photos, motivational captions, and branded gear from 2 outdoor equipment companies that sponsored him based on the resume he presented. That resume claimed 3 8,000-meter summits by the age of 28, Cho Oyu in 2014, Manaslu in 2015, and Broad Peak in 2016. For a young, independent climber without family wealth or institutional backing, the progression was impressive enough to earn respect from operators, sponsors, and the climbing community at large. Niels moved through base camp with the bearing of someone accustomed to that respect, shaking hands, exchanging route knowledge, discussing conditions with the authority of a person who had stood on top of 3 of the world's 14 highest mountains. He had not stood on top of any of them. Niels Dekker was not incompetent. He was a genuinely strong climber who performed well at altitude, moved efficiently on technical terrain, and had the cardiovascular fitness to reach high camps on 8,000-meter peaks without assistance beyond standard Sherpa support. His fraud was not about inability. It was about the last 5 to 10%, the final push from a high point to the true summit that separated a strong climb from a completed one. Each time, when conditions deteriorated or his body reached its limit in the final stretch, Niels accepted the turnaround, and each time, before descending, he positioned himself carefully, framed his camera, and photographed himself at the high point in a way that made it indistinguishable from the top. The deception lived in the caption, not the climb. On Cho Oyu in 2014, he had turned around at approximately 26,000 feet, roughly 800 feet below the summit, when weather closed in and his Sherpa recommended descent. The clouds that forced the turnaround also served the fraud perfectly. They obscured the terrain above his position, making it impossible from the photograph alone to determine exactly where he was standing. He posted the image with a summit caption, and the engagement that followed, the congratulations, the sponsorship interest, the follower growth, taught him that the difference between a high point and a summit existed only in the minds of people who had been there, and almost nobody who saw his content had been there. On Manaslu in 2015, he reached approximately 25,800 feet before his body simply couldn't produce what the remaining 1,000 vertical feet demanded. His Sherpa recommended descent, and Niels agreed without argument. Before turning around, he positioned himself with the summit ridge behind him at an angle that, to anyone who hadn't stood on Manaslu's true summit, looked identical to the top. The photo was convincing. The caption was confident. The comments were celebratory. No one questioned it. On Broad Peak in 2016, the fraud was almost unnecessary. Broad Peak's false summit at approximately 26,400 feet sits so close in elevation and appearance to the true summit at 26,414 feet that legitimate climbers have genuinely believed they completed the ascent after reaching it. The dangerous traverse between the two, an exposed ridge with significant avalanche risk, separated them by only 14 vertical feet, but by a gap in commitment that many climbers declined to cross. Niels reached the false summit, knew it was not the true top, and photographed himself there anyway. Of all his fabrications, this was the most defensible, the one where even honest climbers had made the same mistake unknowingly. Niels made it knowingly, and the distinction existed only inside his own head. The system that enabled the fraud was simple and structural. Summit verification in mountaineering is largely honor-based. There is no centralized authority that confirms whether a climber stood on the true summit versus a nearby high point. Summit photos are the primary evidence, and the people who could identify the difference, climbers who had actually stood on those specific summits, represented a tiny fraction of Niels' audience. The vast majority of his 55,000 followers could not distinguish the south summit of Everest from the true summit, the false summit of Broad Peak from the real one, or a high camp on Manaslu from the top. They saw a man in mountaineering gear standing above clouds with a panoramic backdrop, and they believed what the caption told them. The second structural element was isolation. Niels used a different operator for each expedition, different companies, different Sherpas, different support teams. The individual Sherpa who guided him on Cho Oyu knew that Niels had turned around 800 feet below the summit, but that Sherpa had no connection to the Sherpa who guided him on Manaslu or the one on Broad Peak. Each guide saw a single data point, one client who turned around on one mountain, and none of them followed Niels' social media or had reason to contradict a paying client's post-expedition claims. The fraud survived because the witnesses were siloed. Each one knew a piece of the truth. None of them had the full picture. Niels' Everest guide was Pemba Chering, 36 years old, from Namche Bazaar, a veteran of 13 years in the guiding profession with 7 Everest summits behind him. He was professional, experienced, and direct in the way that guides with extensive client histories tended to be, patient with legitimate questions, intolerant of unnecessary risk, and skilled at reading a client's true capacity beneath whatever confidence they projected. He supported a wife and 3 children, his eldest son requiring regular treatment in Kathmandu for a chronic respiratory condition that consumed a significant portion of seasonal income. Pemba had no reason to doubt Niels' qualifications. A client with 3 claimed 8,000-meter summits at 29 years old warranted a strong but standard guide, not close supervision, not the gentle management that inexperienced clients required. The operator assigned Pemba to Niels based on the resume, and Pemba accepted the assignment with the expectation that this would be a straightforward season with a capable client. The first acclimatization rotation to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet confirmed the expectation. Niels climbed well, strong pace, efficient movement, controlled breathing on the fixed ropes through the icefall. He handled the ladder crossings with the familiarity of someone who had done this kind of terrain before, and his physical conditioning was evident in the way he maintained rhythm on the steeper sections, without the excessive rest stops that less prepared climbers required. Pemba noted the ability and adjusted his assessment accordingly. Whatever this client needed, it wasn't help getting up the mountain. What Pemba also noticed, without attaching significance to it, was Niels' relationship with his camera. Most clients photographed the icefall, the views, the camps. Niels did this too, but with an additional layer of attention that went beyond documentation. He studied angles. He positioned himself relative to terrain features and shot test frames from multiple positions, checking the results on his camera screen with the critical eye of someone composing rather than simply recording. At Camp 1, he spent 20 minutes photographing the view upward toward the western CWM and the Lhotse face, adjusting his position repeatedly to change how the terrain framed behind him. Pemba interpreted this as the behavior of someone who took their social media seriously. It was not unusual. Many clients curated their expedition content carefully. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,300 feet and the third to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet reinforced both Niels' physical credibility and his photographic obsession. He climbed well at every stage, his body adapted efficiently. His movements on the Lhotse face were controlled and confident, and his oxygen saturation readings remained strong. He was one of the more capable clients on the mountain, and nothing in his performance suggested that his claimed resume was anything other than accurate. At Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, Niels spent the rest period studying the terrain above through binoculars rather than sleeping. He examined the upper mountain in detail, the south col, the southeast ridge, the balcony, and the distinctive profile of the south summit, and the final ridge leading to the true summit. He photographed the view from multiple positions and angles, paying particular attention to how the south summit related visually to the true summit from below. The cornice ridge connecting them, the knife-edged traverse, the Hillary step, was visible as a dramatic line against the sky. From Camp 3, the relationship between the two was clear. From the south summit itself, the perspective would be different, and that difference was what Niels was already calculating. Pemba noticed the extended study session and asked if Niels was assessing route conditions. Niels responded that he was familiarizing himself with the upper mountain, so that summit day felt like terrain he already knew. The answer was plausible and unremarkable. Pemba accepted it and returned to melting snow for water. What he did not know was that Niels was solving a specific problem: how to photograph himself at the south summit in a way that would pass for the true summit when posted online. And the problem was harder than any he had solved on his previous peaks. The weather window opened on May 18th. The push from base camp to Camp 4 took 2 days, with overnight stops at Camp 2 and Camp 3. Niels climbed well on the approach, his pace dictated by the deliberate rhythm that experienced altitude climbers adopted to conserve energy for the summit push. At Camp 3, he was focused, but not anxious, the body language of someone who understood the process and trusted the system. The system, of course, was his own. Climb high, accept the turnaround, take the photo, post the caption. Everest was the biggest stage, but the performance was the same. They reached Camp 4 on the South Col at approximately 26,000 feet on the afternoon of May 20th, a bleak, wind-hammered shelf of rock and ice where the air held roughly 40% of sea-level oxygen. Tents were anchored against gusts that swept across the col with unpredictable violence, their fabrics snapping so hard the sound carried over the wind. Spindrift filled vestibules with fine crystals that melted against skin and refroze on fabric. The col felt less like a camp and more like a waiting room between the mountain below and the death zone above, a place where climbers rested without recovering, ate without appetite, and stared at tent walls while their bodies quietly deteriorated. Pemba checked Niels' condition. Oxygen saturation with supplemental flow read in the low 70s, acceptable for the altitude. Physical condition appeared strong. The summit push would proceed. Quick reminder: if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. Niels lay in his sleeping bag as wind battered the tent, and for the first time during the expedition, he confronted something his previous peaks had not required him to face. Camp 4 on Everest sat at 26,000 feet, 400 feet below his highest previous point on Broad Peak's false summit. The summit push would take him to 28,700 feet at the south summit, and potentially higher if he needed to move along the ridge for the right photo angle. That was 2,300 feet above anything his body had ever experienced. His previous frauds had all occurred at or near his physical ceiling, high points where turning around was both the honest and the necessary decision. Everest's south summit would push him into genuinely unknown territory. The altitude above 28,000 feet was different in ways that no amount of fitness or previous experience could fully prepare for, and Niels was about to discover that difference firsthand. The summit push departed Camp 4 at 11 p.m. on May 20th. Clear sky, stars dense in the thin atmosphere, wind manageable on the col, temperature near minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, before wind chill. Other teams departed in the same window, headlamps forming a scattered chain of light ascending toward the southeast ridge. Niels climbed well through the early hours. The route from Camp 4 gained altitude steadily through snow and rock terrain, and his conditioning carried him at a pace that kept him with the stronger climbers. Pemba climbed ahead, setting the rhythm, glancing back periodically to confirm his client was maintaining. The supplemental oxygen hissed through the regulator, and crampons bit into hardpack with each step. They reached the balcony at approximately 27,600 feet around 3 a.m. Niels was still moving well, though Pemba noted a slight slowing in his pace that was consistent with the altitude rather than any specific problem. They continued up the southeast ridge as dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. The light revealed the full scale of what surrounded them. The summit pyramid above, sharp and white against deepening blue sky, and below, the south col shrinking into a gray smudge thousands of feet down. Other climbers were visible on the ridge as dark shapes moving at intervals, each one locked into the private battle that altitude imposed. The wind carried ice crystals that caught the early light and scattered it in brief, sharp flashes. The mountain was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, indifferent to the people moving across it, stunning regardless of whether anyone survived to describe it. Above 28,000 feet, Niels entered territory his body had never known. The altitude hit differently than anything on Cho Oyu, Manaslu, or Broad Peak, all of which topped out below this elevation. His breathing grew more labored despite the supplemental oxygen. His pace dropped noticeably. 20 steps between rest stops, then 15, then 10. His movements on the fixed rope became deliberate in a way that reflected effort rather than confidence. The air at 28,000 feet contained roughly a third of sea level oxygen, and his body was processing the deficit in real time with no previous adaptation to draw on. Pemba monitored the deterioration without alarm. Many strong climbers slowed dramatically above 28,000 feet. It was the nature of extreme altitude rather than a sign of failure. Niels was struggling but functioning, and the pace, while slow, was still productive. They reached the south summit at approximately 28,700 feet, around 5:30 a.m., as dawn flooded the Himalaya in pale gold. The view from the south summit was staggering, the Tibetan plateau stretching north, the Kangshung face dropping away to the east, and directly ahead, the cornice ridge curving towards the Hillary Step and the true summit, approximately 330 vertical feet above. The ridge was unmistakable, even through the fatigue and the thin air. Niels could see the problem he had studied from Camp 3, confirmed in person. The continuing ridge toward the true summit was visible from every angle on the established route at the south summit. The knife-edge cornice, the rocky step, the final slope, all of it stretched above and ahead in a configuration that was one of the most photographed and recognized stretches of terrain in mountaineering. A photograph taken from the standard position at the south summit would clearly show the ridge continuing upward. Anyone with basic Everest knowledge, and millions of people had it, would recognize immediately that the photo was taken at the south summit, not the top. His previous peaks had not presented this problem. Cho Oyu's summit area was obscured by clouds. Manaslu's summit ridge was unfamiliar to most viewers. Broad Peak's false summit was visually identical to the true one, but Everest's final ridge was iconic. The fraud required a different angle, one that eliminated the continuing ridge from the frame and made the south summit look like the highest point. Conditions were deteriorating. Wind had increased from manageable to uncomfortable, pushing spindrift across the ridge in sheets. Cloud was building to the west. Pemba assessed the situation and recommended turning around. They were past conservative turnaround time. Conditions were worsening, and the true summit was still 330 vertical feet away across the most exposed terrain on the route. Niels agreed without resistance. This was his pattern. Accept the call, work within it. The turnaround was both physically necessary and professionally familiar. Pemba began preparing for the descent. He moved onto the fixed line below the south summit, checking anchors and positioning himself for the down climb that would take them back through the southeast ridge toward the balcony in Camp 4. Before following, Niels told Pemba he needed a minute to take photographs. The request was unremarkable. Clients photographed at high points on every expedition, and Pemba acknowledged it with a nod before turning his attention to the descent route below. Niels was alone on the south summit with his camera and the problem that had followed him from Camp 3. From the established route, every angle included the ridge above, the corniced traverse, the rocky step, the final summit slope. They occupied the frame, no matter how he positioned himself. The only direction that offered what he needed was east, along the ridge toward the Kangshung face, where a slight rise in the corniced snow would block the view of the continuing ridge if he moved far enough along it. He unclipped from the fixed line and moved along the ridge toward the east. The snow beneath his crampons looked solid, white, wind-packed, the same surface he had been climbing on all morning. He moved carefully, aware of the exposure but focused on the angle. Each step along the ridge changed the visual relationship between his position and the summit above. 10 feet from the fixed line, the ridge was still visible. 20 feet, and the corniced rise began to obscure the lower portion. 30 feet, and the angle was nearly right. The continuing ridge was blocked by the snow feature to his left, and behind him, the Himalayan panorama spread in a sweep that would make any photograph look like the top of the world. He stopped. This was the angle. He positioned his ice axe upright in the snow beside him, removed his goggles to show his face clearly, and raised his camera. Below, Pemba had moved several body lengths down the fixed line when something made him look back up toward the south summit. What he saw sent adrenaline through exhaustion. Niels was off the fixed line, standing on the corniced ridge, 30 feet from the established route, on terrain that Pemba recognized immediately as the overhanging edge of the Kangshung face. He shouted. At 28,700 feet, in wind that was pushing 20 miles per hour across the ridge, the sound covered a fraction of the distance before it dissolved. Pemba began climbing back up the fixed line towards the south summit. He was seconds away. The distance between them was 30 feet of horizontal ridge, and the vertical difference between the fixed line and the crest. Seconds that the mountain did not grant. The cornice fractured on a line that ran behind where the overhang visually began, a fundamental characteristic of cornices that every experienced mountaineer understood, and that Niels, standing on the wrong side of that line, did not feel until the snow shifted beneath his feet. The break was clean, sudden, and total. The section of snow he was standing on separated from the ridge and dropped. Niels Decker fell down the Kangshung face of Mount Everest, a near vertical wall of ice and rock that plunged more than 10,000 feet to the glacier below. The fall was not survivable from the first second. There was no ledge to catch him, no slope to slow the acceleration, no feature between the cornice and the glacier that could have changed the outcome. He was gone before the sound of the fracture finished echoing off the ridge. Pemba climbed back up to the fracture point. The broken cornice edge was sharp and clean, a fresh wound in the snow that exposed the layered structure of wind-built overhang and the empty air beneath it. He looked over the edge. The Kangshung face dropped away into cloud and shadow, a vertical void that swallowed everything. There was nothing to see. There was nothing to do. He remained at the edge for a long moment, long enough that the cold began penetrating his gloves, and the wind pushed him off balance. Then he turned around and descended. Niels Decker's body was never recovered. Pemba Chering descended to Camp 4 and reported the death as a tragic accident, a client who stepped onto a cornice while photographing at the south summit. In the weeks that followed, the climbing community examined Niels's summit history with the scrutiny that death invites and life does not. Experienced climbers identified inconsistencies in his photos, terrain at Broad Peak matching the false summit, Manaslu's ridge angle matching a position below the top, cloud patterns on Cho Oyu consistent with where weather had turned back multiple teams. Former Sherpas from each expedition confirmed what the photos suggested. 3 8,000-meter summits, all fabricated. Pemba sustained no physical injuries. What he carried was the image of looking back and seeing his client on the corniced edge, the shout that didn't reach, the fracture in the seconds between recognition and response. He continues guiding, but he states in interviews that the memory of that broken edge follows him through every season that comes after. The fraud that kept Niels Decker alive on 3 mountains was the same pattern that killed him on the 4th. He didn't die because he climbed too high. He died because he stopped short and needed the mountain to look like something it wasn't. On Cho Oyu, the clouds hid the truth. On Manaslu, the angle cooperated. On Broad Peak, the false summit did the work. On Everest, the mountain offered no such courtesy. The lie required him to stand where no climber would stand, and the mountain broke beneath him. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.